The winter of 1944 was supposed to bring closure. Berlin was in sight, German fuel reserves were nearly gone, and Allied commanders believed the enemy was too exhausted to launch anything larger than a desperate counterattack. Yet what unfolded in December shocked even the most seasoned officers. Across the dense Ardennes forest, the last major German offensive erupted with a ferocity no one in the Allied camp had predicted. And standing at the center of the political storm that followed was a man who had built his entire reputation on discipline, precision, and absolute confidence: Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. Montgomery had always been a polarizing figure. To the British public, he was the hero of El Alamein, the commander who had halted Rommel when no one else could. To many American generals, however, he was something else entirely. Brilliant, yes, but infuriatingly arrogant. He spoke bluntly, refused to flatter, and had a rare gift for provoking resentment even among his allies. But no one, not even his critics, expected that a single press conference in January 1945 could ignite the kind of diplomatic explosion that would shake the entire Allied coalition. As the Ardennes battle raged, the situation deteriorated rapidly. By mid-December, the German advance had punched a massive dent, the infamous Bulge, into American lines. Entire divisions were overrun, roadways clogged with retreating vehicles and isolated pockets of resistance. Weather grounded Allied aircraft. American commanders scrambled to contain the assault, and the scale of the chaos became impossible to ignore. Montgomery watched from the northern flank, commanding the 21st Army Group. He had not anticipated the German attack either, but he reacted swiftly. When the northern U.S. forces reeled backward, their command and communications shattered, Eisenhower gave Montgomery temporary control of all American units in that sector. It was a controversial but unavoidable decision, one that placed Monty at the head of over 200,000 American troops. And this, unknowingly, set the stage for one of the worst political disasters of the war. The fighting was brutal. Montgomery reorganized battered formations, stabilized the collapsing front, and blocked further German penetration north of the Meuse. Meanwhile, Patton, impatient, aggressive, and everything Monty was not, executed his legendary 90-degree turn, rushing his Third Army northward to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne. American soldiers fought ferociously in sub-zero temperatures, many lacking proper winter gear, yet refusing to buckle. Their resistance, combined with the gradual return of Allied air superiority, slowed the German thrust to a crawl. By early January, the German gamble had failed. Casualties were immense, the front lines were nearly restored, and Montgomery prepared what he believed would be a straightforward account of his role in the victory. He could not have miscalculated more. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery stepped before a crowd of reporters. Confident and composed, dressed in his trademark beret, he delivered a detailed summary of the northern sector of the battle. But the problem wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't say. He praised his own planning, emphasized his steady leadership, highlighted the flawless execution of the British divisions under his command, and described how he personally coordinated American forces to restore order in the chaos. All of this was technically accurate, but he barely mentioned U.S. commanders. Not Patton, not Hodges, not Middleton, and most critically, he failed to acknowledge the tens of thousands of American soldiers who had bled to halt Hitler's last offensive. For American generals listening via transcript, the message felt unmistakable. Montgomery was claiming credit for winning the Battle of the Bulge. By that evening, outrage swept through U.S. headquarters like a shockwave. Eisenhower, normally calming, diplomatic, patient, was furious. His chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, was livid. Omar Bradley was incandescent with anger, calling Montgomery's remarks a massive distortion. Patton, true to his nature, exploded with profanity. And Ernest Harmon, commander of the 2nd Armored Division, reportedly slammed his fist on a table and shouted, "Monty's stealing our damn victory." Word traveled fast. Newspapers began framing the story as a British general taking credit for an American battle. Political advisors warned Eisenhower that public perception could damage Allied unity at a critical moment. Framing the story as a British general taking credit for an American battle. Political advisors warned Eisenhower that public perception could damage Allied unity at a critical moment. Churchill received cables urging him to intervene before the situation spiraled out of control. The irony was that Montgomery had not intended to insult anyone. His speech reflected his rigid worldview: clear structure, calm leadership, methodical operations. What he saw as a factual report, others saw as an act of outrageous self-promotion. And because the press conference was broadcast across Europe and summarized in American papers, the controversy spread far beyond military headquarters. Inside the Allied command, relationships began to fracture. Bradley refused to speak to Montgomery. Patton demanded Eisenhower publicly correct the record. Smith urged decisive action, warning that morale among American troops could suffer if they believed their sacrifices were being minimized. Even British commanders privately admitted that Monty had shot himself in both feet. What made the incident especially volatile was the timing. The Germans were not yet defeated, not fully. The Rhine had not been crossed. Political unity was essential to prevent giving Hitler even the faintest hope of fracturing the coalition. Yet now, instead of celebrating a hard-won victory, the Allied High Command found itself fighting a political battle against one of its own. Montgomery, meanwhile, seemed unaware of the magnitude of the storm he had unleashed. He believed he had simply stated military facts as he saw them. But the Allies did not judge him for his strategy. They judged him for his tone. And for a man who had spent years cultivating an image as Britain's most disciplined, most controlled commander, he suddenly found himself at the center of a scandal that threatened to overshadow his wartime legacy. What happened next turned a tense situation into a near-diplomatic crisis, one that forced Montgomery to make a decision he had never made before. He would have to apologize. The morning after Montgomery's press conference, the Allied command structure felt less like a unified war machine and more like a room filled with ticking grenades. Reports of anger among American generals reached Eisenhower within hours, and by sunrise on January 8th, he realized the situation had spiraled far beyond a simple misunderstanding. What Montgomery had intended as a calm operational briefing had detonated into a political catastrophe that threatened to poison the final phase of the war. Eisenhower sat at his desk in Reims, the weight of the coalition on his shoulders. His cigarette burned down between his fingers as he stared at the transcript of Montgomery's speech. He had read it twice already. The words themselves weren't offensive, not overtly, but he knew exactly why his American officers were enraged. In war, perception could be just as deadly as bullets, and the perception now was that the British hero of El Alamein had stepped forward to claim the victory his American allies had bled for. Outside his office, the tension was palpable. Staff officers whispered, avoiding eye contact. The corridors buzzed with rumors of a direct confrontation between Eisenhower and Montgomery, or worse, of Washington demanding the field marshal's removal. A breakdown in Allied relations now, in the final push toward Berlin, would be catastrophic. The German front was collapsing, but it wasn't dead yet. Meanwhile, the American generals were in open revolt. General Omar Bradley, normally calm and pragmatic, slammed the transcript onto a table in front of his staff. His voice was icy, trembling with restrained fury. "He wiped out everything we did," Bradley said. "Everything, as if the U.S. Army just stood aside while Montgomery saved the day." Patton, predictably, was even less diplomatic. "That prima donna son of a," he snapped, pacing like an angry bull. "He sits there polishing his reputation while our boys froze to death in the Ardennes. The arrogance." Even General Courtney Hodges, whose First Army had borne the brunt of the German assault, felt humiliated. His headquarters had nearly been overrun, his division shattered, his forward units crushed beneath the weight of the surprise offensive. Yet his men had held. They had fought through snow, ice, hunger, and fear. And now the newspapers were reporting that a British commander had restored order and coordinated the successful defensive operations. Eisenhower had no choice. He would have to confront Montgomery directly. The message he sent to the field marshal was stern but controlled. "The American command is disturbed by the impression created yesterday. This must be addressed immediately." Montgomery received the cable at his headquarters in Zonhoven. When he read it, he frowned, puzzled rather than offended. He genuinely didn't understand what he had done wrong. In his mind, he had delivered a precise, factual statement. He had stabilized the Northern Front. He had restructured the command. He had coordinated with American units.
all true. But what he failed to grasp, what he had always failed to grasp, was how his tone struck others. Monty had spent decades honing a leadership style built around absolute clarity. He didn't embellish. He didn't flatter. He presented events as he believed they were. This made him effective in combat, but dangerously blind to political nuance. Still, even he could not ignore the severity of the backlash. That night, as wind howled across the frozen Belgian fields, Montgomery sat alone in his headquarters tent, reading the American newspapers. His stomach tightened as he scanned the headlines. British Field Marshal takes credit for Bulge victory. American generals outraged by Montgomery's claims. Did Monty steal the spotlight? This was not merely bad press. This was a threat to the Allied war effort. Across the Atlantic, political pressure mounted. Senators demanded explanations. Military advisors warned President Roosevelt that Allied relations were suddenly fragile at the exact moment unity mattered most. British newspapers tried to soften the controversy, but the damage was done. Churchill, upon receiving updates, nearly exploded. He admired Montgomery's battlefield discipline. He always had, but he also knew the field marshal had a knack for generating unnecessary drama. Churchill wired Eisenhower personally, urging him to prevent the matter from spiraling any further. The Americans wanted one thing: acknowledgement. Not groveling, not
British humiliation, just recognition that their forces had borne the brunt of the Ardennes battle and had played the decisive role in pushing back the German offensive. Eisenhower called Montgomery directly. The conversation was tense. "Bernard," Eisenhower said, "you must correct the impression. The Americans feel as if their sacrifices were diminished." Montgomery's reply was calm, almost too calm. "I assure you, Ike, that was never my intention." "I know that," Eisenhower said. "They don't." Silence followed. Then Eisenhower, usually the most diplomatic of commanders, broke his restraint. "For the sake of the coalition, you will have to speak again." Montgomery paused. He hated political theater. He hated public relations. He hated anything that wasn't operational clarity. But even he understood the gravity of Eisenhower's tone. "I see," he said quietly. "Very well." That night, however, things only got worse. American officers within the northern sector, men Montgomery currently commanded, began circulating rumors that their units might request to return under direct American leadership. Some staff members whispered that they would refuse British directives if the situation escalated. This was dangerously close to insubordination and dangerously close to fracturing the coalition. Meanwhile, German intelligence, monitoring Allied radio chatter, became aware of the internal conflict. In Berlin, propaganda experts began drafting material to exploit the controversy. Even in defeat, Hitler hoped for a miracle, and this political firestorm offered the faintest glimmer of hope. But the most significant impact fell not on generals or politicians, but on the soldiers themselves. In foxholes across Belgium and Luxembourg, exhausted American troops read the newspapers their officers brought from headquarters. Their reactions were raw. "After everything we went through," one sergeant muttered, "some British general gets up there and says he saved us? Hell no." Morale, the fragile lifeline that kept men fighting in the bitter cold, wavered. This, Eisenhower knew, was the true danger. The Allied coalition had survived egos before. It had survived strategic disagreements, conflicting national interests, even personal rivalries. But it had never faced a crisis that struck directly at the pride of the men doing the fighting. If the bond between American and British soldiers fractured, the final drive into Germany would become infinitely more difficult. Montgomery realized it too. For the first time in the war, the field marshal understood that he could not fight this battle with maps, divisions, or artillery. This required something far more difficult for him: humility. He would have to fix this. And that meant standing before the world again, not as the austere field marshal, but as a man willing to step back from the spotlight. The problem was simple. Montgomery had never apologized publicly in his entire military career. But now he would have to, or risk tearing the Allied coalition apart. When dawn rose over the frost-bitten fields of Belgium on January 9, 1945, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery felt a weight he had never carried before.
a weight heavier than any battlefield responsibility he had borne in North Africa, Sicily, or Normandy. It was the burden of having to repair something he had not intended to break. His chief of staff entered the room quietly, carrying a stack of international newspapers. Montgomery didn't need to read them. He already knew what they said. But still, he forced himself to flip through the pages. It was like watching the same explosion from different angles. Monty claims victory in Bulge. U.S. command furious with Field Marshal. Allied rift growing. The worst headline came from an American paper. Did Montgomery just rewrite the history of the battle? The Field Marshal closed the newspaper slowly, his jaw tightening. He had spent his life believing that absolute clarity was the highest military virtue. But now clarity had become a weapon turned against him. By mid-morning, his headquarters received a signal. Eisenhower requests immediate address to clarify earlier statements, coalition stability at stake. Montgomery did not argue. He simply said, "Very well." But inside, he felt something close to dread. He was not afraid of speaking publicly. He had done that dozens at a time.
He was not afraid of criticism. He had endured that his entire career. But what unsettled him was something deeper. The understanding that he had wounded the pride of the very men who had held the front while he reorganized the line. To diminish American sacrifice was not just a political error, it was a moral one. And so, late in the afternoon, Montgomery began drafting the speech that would shape the future of Allied cooperation. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of a kerosene stove. Outside, the Belgian winter pressed against the canvas walls. Montgomery hunched over the desk, writing slowly, scratching out lines, rewriting them. His staff kept their distance. They knew better than to interrupt him. For the first time in the war, the field marshal was writing not as a commander giving orders, but as a man trying to repair something fragile. He wrote, "The American soldiers fought magnificently. Their role was decisive." He paused. The words felt insufficient, too rehearsed, too politically clean. He tried again. Had it not been for the stubborn bravery of the American troops at the front, the German attack would have broken through entirely. Better, but still not right. Then he wrote something he had never publicly said about another nation's army. "The fighting qualities of the American soldier in the Ardennes were superb. I pay the highest possible tribute to them." When he finished, he put down the pen. The speech was ready. But giving it would be another matter. For the first time in his career, Montgomery felt nerves. Not fear, nerves. He wasn't worried about criticism. He was worried he might fail to heal the wound. Because if he failed, the consequences would ripple far beyond personal reputation. It could delay the final advance into Germany. It could endanger lives. It could even unravel the Allied coalition. The next morning, in a crowded press tent filled with British, American, and Canadian reporters, Montgomery stepped onto the makeshift stage. Camera shutters clicked, typewriters rattled. His uniform, immaculate as always, contrasted sharply with his tired face. He gripped the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice heady, "I want to clarify certain impressions created by my earlier remarks." Every eye locked onto him. Every pencil hovered. "I wish to express my admiration for the magnificent conduct of the American armies during the Battle of the Bulge. Let there be no misunderstanding. The American troops fought and won the crucial battle that blunted the German offensive." The room was silent. Montgomery continued, "The 1st and 3rd U.S. armies bore the brunt of the attack. Their leadership was steadfast. Their courage was exemplary. Without their resistance, the enemy would have achieved a far greater penetration." He paused, breathing in slowly. "I wish to pay the highest tribute to General Hodges, whose men fought in conditions of unimaginable hardship, and to General Patton, whose counterattack from the south was conducted with brilliance and energy." Montgomery had never publicly praised Patton before. The moment froze in the air like ice. Cameras clicked furiously. Furthermore, Montgomery said, "I want it clearly understood that I claim no credit for their achievements. The American soldiers earned this victory." When he finished, there was a long, uncertain silence, the kind that follows the unexpected. Then the reporters erupted. Questions flew from every direction. Microphones were thrust forward. Photographers crowded the front. But Montgomery didn't retreat. He answered every question directly, patiently, without a trace of defensiveness. He did more than issue a correction. He issued respect, genuine, visible, undeniable. And that changed everything. The reaction was immediate. General Bradley read the transcript and nodded slowly. Good, that's the right tone. Hodges, exhausted but relieved, said only, "That was decent of him." Patton, who had expected arrogance, smirked. "Well, I'll be damned. Monty just swallowed his pride." But Eisenhower simply closed his eyes and exhaled. Relief washed through him. The coalition had survived. Across the American front, morale began to stabilize. Letters home mentioned the apology. Newspapers printed the new statements side by side with the old. The impression shifted. Tension eased. But the
act in Britain was different. Some British officers felt Montgomery had bowed too deeply. Others believed he had protected the Allied bond and done what was necessary. What no one disputed was that the field marshal had just done something profoundly un-Montgomery-like. He had taken responsibility for the political fallout, entirely on himself. This act, more than any battlefield maneuver, revealed a side of Montgomery rarely seen. The commander who understood that victory required unity, not ego. That night, long after the press had left and the lamps were dimmed, Montgomery stood alone outside his headquarters. Snow drifted across the dark fields. Distant artillery thundered on the horizon. His aide approached quietly. "Sir, you did the right thing today." Montgomery didn't turn. He simply said, "It was not about being right. It was about keeping the army together." He looked toward the east, toward Germany, where the final battles awaited. The apology had cost him something, but it had preserved something far greater. By late January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over, but the ripples of Montgomery's January 7th press conference still echoed across the Allied command. In London, newspapers debated his audacity. In Washington, generals questioned his judgment. Even Churchill had to intervene, spending political capital to mend tensions between Britain and the United States. Montgomery, outwardly calm, continued inspecting troops and coordinating logistics. Yet he realized that war was fought not only in snow and mud, but in perception and politics. His press conference, intended to highlight British contributions, had unintentionally overshadowed the Americans, implying that without British guidance, victory would have been impossible. Exhausted American commanders were angered, their pride was wounded, and reporters amplified every slight. Eisenhower acted swiftly. He convened his senior staff to manage the fallout, ensuring that American achievements were properly recognized while maintaining unity. Montgomery was brought into the discussion, but quickly understood the delay.